After Englobement, Carl Schmitt, Peter Sloterdijk, and the Recovery of the Incompressible by Ethan Stoneman from Cultural Politics, Volume 16, 3, November 2020. Abstract. This article positions Peter Sloterdijk's Spheres project against Carl Schmitt's spatial writings, showing that Sloterdijk's anthropo-philosophical approach to spatial analysis implies a theoretical strategy for thinking beyond Schmitt's fatalistic view of the deep contingencies shaping human social existence. Schmitt's spatial pessimism is particularly noticeable in Land and Sea, in which he recounts the unfolding of world history as a succession of spatial epochs, arguing that the modern era can best be understood as the achievement of a centuries-long path toward a unified global space of nihilistic anarchy, a development that he comes to refer to as Englobement. The legacy of Schmitt's spatial history of modernity can be seen most urgently today by its influence on the emergent right-wing identitarian and neo-Eurasian movements, which seek to transform Schmitt's pessimistic nostalgia for a prior mode of spatial ordering into an expansionist geopolitics. The author maintains that, against that legacy, Sloterdijk proposes spherology, a unique practice of spatial anthropology through which he teases out an art of writing at the service of experience, seeking to understand the phenomenon of human togetherness not in terms of determinate political or territorial forms, but as a function of shared spaces, spheres, set up and stretched out through shared living in them. By affirming and potentially informing the ever-renewable possibility of lived extendedness in local shared enclosures, Sloterdijk's theorization of the spatial constitutes a compelling countercurrent or immunological defence against the forces of nostalgia and resignation that feed into reactionary spatial thought. Much can be said about Carl Schmitt, both as a person and as a thinker, but optimistic typically does not make the cut. In many of his inter- and post-war writings, Schmitt put forward a number of grim assessments regarding the current state and future prospects of an increasingly technological liberal modernity. While not achieving the heights of cultural pessimistic despair of E.M. Turin or Giacomo Leopardi, Schmitt's writings during this period tend to reflect a fatalistic outlook toward the deep contingencies shaping human social existence, as well as toward the ability of collective actors to locate a foundation with which to stabilize this shifting existence and provide it with a determinate political form. This quality is especially noticeable in Schmitt's so-called spatial writings, particularly Land and Sea from 1942, in which he recounts the unfolding of world history as a succession of spatial epochs, arguing provocatively that the modern era can best be understood as the achievement of a centuries-long path towards a unified, homogeneous, global space of nihilistic anarchy, a development that he comes to refer to as englobement. Both occasioned and accompanied by a spaceless, spatial consciousness, this global spatial revolution, he argues, offers no meaningful division or orientation, and thus results in radical despatialization at the global scale. Histrionic trappings notwithstanding, Schmidt's diagnosis of what amounts to terminal spaceless nihilism on a global scale is not mere conservative or mere conservative revolutionary nostalgia over the loss of meaning for the nation-state. Although the formal crisis of modern mass societies is seen chiefly by some, especially those on the political right, in terms of the erosion of territorially grounded collectives and the trend toward polyethnic or denationalised places, concern about the dislocative, potentially nihilistic effects of globalised spatial modernity on consciousness and the organisation of experience in society and politics animates the critical writings of a diverse range of contemporary thinkers, from members of the Frankfurt School during Schmidt's time to more current thinkers such as Paul Virilio, Zygmunt Bauman, and Franco Biffo Berardi, to name but a few, none of whom have any truck with conservative or right-wing politics and ideology. Be that as it may, as Stuart Eldon, 2010, underscores in his assessment of Schmidt's spatial writings, Schmidt's complicity with National Socialism should never be forgotten, nor should this political association be seen as unconnected to his work on territory, the world and global order, which was developed during the Nazi period. See Ben Dursky, 1983. Most fundamentally, wrote Eldon, it must be remembered that Schmidt was once a passionate advocate of a German Grossraum, or geopolitical sphere of influence, and that as much as he may have tried to obscure the explicit political context in which he formed his spatial thought, his writings about an encroaching spaceless ordering of global space and the prospects of a new nomos remain reactionary texts. These include not only the nomos of the earth and the Grossraum order of international law, where Schmidt's imagination of a new nomos for the future includes speculations about cultural Grossraum as a new way in which the earth may be divided up spatially, but also, and just as significantly, land and sea. It is the latter's pessimistic nostalgia for a prior mode of spatial ordering and accompanying consciousness that sustains and cultivates the reactionary imaginings of the former. With that observation in mind, what makes Schmidt's unique diagnosis particularly pressing and deserving of critical response is the implicit psycho-political challenge to find ways and means of increasing the spacious dimensions of the world without resorting to, strengthening, or drawing on the currents of nostalgia and despair that too often generate reactionary conservatism. Such a caveat remains especially pertinent today, given that the legacy of Schmidt's spatial writings lives on not only among dispassionate scholarly journals and academic conferences, but also in the rise of the right. In a European context, that legacy finds renewed expression in the identitarian intellectual and activist movement, primarily by way of Alain de Benoist, and the influence of his European Nouvelle Droite, which helped establish the geopolitical master frame through which the identitarians of today view and interpret international events, processes, and dynamics. The Neo-Eurasia movement, founded by Alexander Dugin, the reactionary and former advisor to Vladimir Putin, and likewise drawing on de Benoist's N.D., constitutes another conduit for the continuation of Schmidt's geopolitical legacy. Quote, following Schmidt's suggestion that the new nomos be constituted by an equilibrium of several independent geopolitical, cultural and civilizational blocks, ND theorists and neo-Eurasianists have defended a multipolar system in which Europe, in alliance with Russia, would be a united and autonomous power committed to its own project of civilization. End quote. For that reason, while Schmidt's eschatological depiction of an increasingly orderless world unity names a major cause of psychosocial and political trauma, the potential rhetorical effectivity of that diagnosis offers, at best, pessimistic resignation in the face of a new anthropological horizon of spaceless, transnational mobility. At worst, that subjective adherence threatens to transform such fatalistic despair into a heroic realism, or assertive nostalgia whose motivational consequences tend to result in the pursuit of an imperialist federal order among European states. Enter the contemporary German philosopher and cultural theorist Peter Sloterdijk, whose medico-philosophical approach to the processes of globalization promises to think beyond Schmidt's volatile pessimism. Like Schmidt, Sloterdijk takes seriously the radical changes to human spatiality brought on by the emergence of global space. Indeed, he claims that the development and consolidation of an interconnected world system despatialize the real globe, replacing the curved Earth with a synchronous world interior of capital that neutralizes distance and compresses all that was heretofore extended into an almost extensionless point. At the same time, however, Sloterdijk articulates that interpretation with his own unique practice of a spatial anthropology, spherology, through which he teases out an art of writing at the service of experience, seeking to understand the phenomenon of human togetherness, not in terms of determinate political or territorial forms, but as a function of shared spaces, spheres, set up and stretched out through shared living in them. Such spatial theorization, which is itself a political phenomenon, proposes a therapeutic strategy that, by responding to the issue of the organization of coexistence by means of common tuning and community, prescribes an alter-modernity that is resistant to Schmidt's diagnostic of englobement and the corresponding yet superficially opposed currents of fatalism and conservative revolution. Although references to Schmidt in Sloterdijk's oeuvre are not extensive, Sloterdijk's spherological approach to globalization implies at once a rejection of Schmidt's spatial pessimism and a pharmacon of sorts to its persuasive appeal. As Nigel Thrift argues, Sloterdijk's spatial anthropology, quote, emphasizes the materiality of thinking about and exploring the possibility of a new awareness, end quote. Here I want to position that awareness, making vis-a-vis Schmidt's theory of spatial revolution, to show how Sloterdijk's theorization of the spatial, by affirming and potentially informing the ever-renewable possibility of lived extendedness in local shared enclosures, constitutes a countercurrent or immunological defence against the forces of nostalgia and resignation that feed into Schmidt's reactionary spatial thought. On this view, wherever human beings are, wherever there is, they are in spaces opened up to them, not by virtue of spatial revolutions or changes in spatial consciousness, but because they have given them form, substance, extension, and relative duration. Spatial revolutions. One of the key elements running throughout Schmidt's spatial turn, and connecting his interwar works with those of the post-war period, is the spatial history of modernity. Conceived as a theory of modernization in spatial terms, Schmidt's spatio-historical framework functions hermeneutically to disclose the relationship between the history of liberal modernity and the emergence and development of global space. Writing against conventional histories and the linear flow of historical events, Schmidt understood world history as consisting of a series of discontinuities between epochs and their respective spatial logics. For Schmidt, wrote Oliver Simons, the essence of world history is twofold. Quote, each epoch is designated by a break with the previous era and is defined by a specific spatial order. End quote. Crucial to understanding such epochal shifts, as well as Schmidt's conception of the relationship between space and history, is the notion of spatial revolutions, that is, radical transformations in the understanding and experience of space and related spatial practices. First introduced and expounded on most fully in Land and Sea, spatial revolutions are inaugural events that tend to signify dramatic changes in the material or geo-elemental conditions of human society, e.g. earth, water, air, fire. Even so, changes in a society's elementary constellations do not of themselves amount to a spatial revolution. Indeed, something approximating a spatial revolution can occur without geo-elemental shifts of human engagement from, say, the earth to the water, or from the water to the air. On Schmidt's view, a genuine spatial revolution requires radical changes in a society's collective spatial consciousness, or spatial conceptions. Such a change, Schmidt argues, is, quote, so deep and so surprising that not only quantities and measurements, not only the outermost human horizon, but even the structure of the concept of space itself is altered, end quote. A change so wide-ranging that it encompasses, quote, all the levels and domains of human existence, end quote. Perceptual, cultural, legal, and so forth. Spatial revolutions are therefore epochal in their effects because radical breaks in spatial consciousness and possibility result in new periods in the historical development of human understanding and social organisation. Nevertheless, for Schmidt, the first full Earth and world-encompassing spatial revolution did not begin until the onset, in the early 16th century, of the European Age of Discovery, and the altered concepts of space that resulted from the circumnavigation of the Earth. All pre-modern spatial revolutions were local rather than, properly speaking, global. That is, tied to specific geographical regions and cultural spheres that understood themselves as occupying the centre of the world. Now, for the first time, Schmidt claims, quote, "A new world emerges, in the bravest sense of the term, and the collective consciousness first of the Western and Central European peoples, and then finally the whole and human collective consciousness is transformed from the ground up," end quote. When 16th century sea adventurers and whale hunters discovered parts of the terrestrial and oceanic world that were until then unknown to European peoples, they simultaneously discovered global space as an irrefutable experience and indisputable scientific truth, and thus changed what Martin Heidegger refers to as the world picture. For the first time, the disclosure of the world as a previously concealed terrestrial orb became a reality, and soon after that, a cartographic and geopolitical fact. With the first complete spatial revolution on a planetary scale, Schmidt argues, quote, "The whole picture of our planet, and beyond this, the whole astronomical conception of the entire universe were changed, with a complete abandonment of received ancient and medieval conceptions," end quote. Hence for Schmidt, as well as for Heidegger, the first authentic spatial revolution was not simply another historical periodization, comparable to any other previous epochal break, but rather constituted a phenomenon specific to modernity and the conquest of the world as picture, the world conceived and grasped as a picture. On this view, the very globality of the first full spatial revolution came to define European modernity, and modernity as such. According to Claudio Minca and Rory Rowan, however, Schmidt's notion of modernity comprises not one but two global spatial revolutions, each with a related but distinct worldview. For Schmidt, they argue, the second spatial revolution occurred during the 20th century and marked the technological intensification of the unification of planetary space. Although the emergence of global space and modernity had already been intimately tied to technological developments, particularly to representational media and modes of navigation, the second global spatial revolution was defined by progress, quote, "in the sense of accelerated scientific, technical and industrial development," end quote. To be sure, while such a notion of progress included the development of new technologies of communication, transportation, industry and the like, it was also, and remains intercalated, according to Schmidt, with the spread of capitalist markets or neoliberalism and the ideological predominance of universalism. Appropriating a term coined by French economist François Perrault, which anticipates the later and now hackneyed term globalization, Schmidt refers to this technologically intensive unification of planetary space as englobement. Like the first global spatial revolution, englobement was accompanied and, in part made possible by, a transformation of spatial consciousness, one extending to all areas of human inquiry and activity, and of such powerful depth and breadth that even the great geopolitical events of the present contain at their core such a change in hitherto existing conceptions of space and presuppositions of space. What set this new consciousness apart from its predecessor, however, is the belief that through the development of modern technologies, a new form of global space could be engendered, a unified, homogeneous planetary space without division, a spaceless non-place, offering no starting point, location, or viewpoint. For Schmidt, the danger of this utopian conception of global space is most evident in the risk it poses to any kind of orientation, since it allows for no meaningful spatial distinctions on which to ground political order. The end result of the total rootlessness of modern technology is thus not limited, according to Schmidt, to the accomplishment of a changed spatial reality, but includes a historically and spatially specific form of nihilistic anarchy. Although Schmidt holds that, quote, every significant alteration and every resituating of the image of the earth is bound up with world political alterations, end quote, he also sees the technologically informed spatial consciousness of the 20th century, combined with its inherent utopianism, as pushing the world towards a formless state of unlimited global anarchy, and potentially, according to G.L. Ullman, a global civil war. Every fundamental order is a spatial order, Schmidt claims. But the obverse does not necessarily follow, and in the case of 20th century, now 21st century englobement, the utopian dream of a universal, spaceless ordering of global space has only engendered conditions for planetary disorder, without division and lacking in orientation. This spaceless nihilism is not, however, completely separate from the previous global spatial revolution, but part and parcel of the development of maritime liberal modernity and its restructuring of the European sense of space away from a land-based form of human existence. While noting the flexibility and capacity of human life to adapt to changing elemental conditions, history has, Schmidt remarked, witnessed both autochthonal and autothalassic peoples. He makes it clear in the opening of Land and Sea that land occupies a primary place in grounding the human condition. The human is a land being, a land dweller. He stands and walks and moves upon the firmly grounded earth. This is his standpoint and his soil. Through it he receives his viewpoint. This defines his impressions and his way of seeing the world. He receives not only his field of vision, but also the form of his gait and his movements, his shape as a living being born and moving upon the earth. End quote. What is more, because land is at once divisible and stable, it possesses an inherent representational quality that admits of a unique order-bearing capacity. Order can be made visible on it in clear, enduring lines of demarcation, so as to represent distinctions and divisions. These ordering lines, Schmidt argues, indicate a fundamental unity of space and law, order and orientation, a nomos, that makes possible all forms of political, legal, and social order. Nomos is thus both, quote, the measure by which the land in a particular order is divided and situated, and the immediate form in which the political and social order of a people becomes spatially visible, end quote. In contrast to the future universal neutral space of englobement, the unity of order represented by a nomos points to a process through which order is grounded in acts of spatial differentiation. Although for Schmitt, world history is a history of land appropriation, the English appropriation of the seas and world oceans transformed a people of shepherds into, quote, a people of children of the sea, end quote, of pirates and corsair capitalists, while simultaneously determining and projecting a new spatial dispensation onto the world sphere, one based primarily on a world economy bound to trade routes and a legal, liberal humanitarian framework that could apply in all places. Unlike the capacity of a land-based nomos to represent distinctions and divisions that bear order, the new spatial arrangement of maritime global modernity dissolved all situated specificity. Global modernity dissolved all situated specificity within a universal sea of what Byung-Chul Han describes as characterless smoothness. A free space without boundaries, distinctions or enclosures, a lawless space that represents no apparent unity of order and orientation. Coupled with the rapid development of the Industrial Revolution, indeed forming its very basis through the advent of industrial shipping and the energies this unleashed, the increasingly abstract, sea-based conception of spatial order marked the first significant step on the path towards the spaceless nihilism and technological worldview that came to dominate 20th century spatial consciousness. Although the growing dominance of technological thinking in all domains would retrospectively mark the beginning of England's imperial decline, by intensifying the universalising process of englobement, the spirit of technicity completed the first global spatial revolution while initiating the second. At the same time, this process helped consolidate dominion over the seas of the world in the expanded figure of an uprooted and deterritorialised Anglo-American empire, with the United States rather than England at the helm. In terms of spatial revolutionary effects, interposing machinery between the sea element and human life also marked a geo-elemental transition in the spatio-historical development of modernity. A transition from an era based on harnessing the power of the world's oceans to the age of electric technology and electrodynamics, of electricity, flight and radio. In one sense, the new era completed the elemental metamorphosis and fundamental transformation that had begun with England's existential decision for the sea, making possible for the first time in history the technical dream of world unity. At the same time, the, quote, development in the objects, means and forms of appropriation, from the sea appropriations of the 16th to the 19th century over the industry appropriations of the industrial technical age to the air appropriations and space appropriations of the present, end quote, signalled the beginning of a new epoch and the blossoming of a specific spatial order. The nihilistic anarchy of an interconnected but spaceless space of englobement. What is more, because the appropriation of air and space and electricity introduced a new dimension into human experience, it radically altered existing horizons of spatial experience and possibility, two of which Schmitt highlights. Quoting Heidegger without directly naming him, Schmitt states that the first shift pertains to a revolution in spatial consciousness. Quote, today, by space, we no longer understand a mere dimension of depth, empty of every conceivable content. Today, a thought first becomes possible for us that would have been impossible in any other epoch, and which a contemporary German philosopher has articulated. The world is not in space, rather space is in the world. End quote. Space, in other words, is no longer understood as a mere dimension of depth, empty of every conceivable content, but, quote, has become a force field of human energy, activity, and achievement, end quote. Something that human beings engender and manipulate through various appropriations, distributions, and productions. This also means, however, that human beings now find themselves for the first time occupying an extrinsic status, as they are liberated not only from empty space, but also from the notion of space as a cosmological shell or celestial firmament. This transformation of spatial concept is not unrelated to the second consequence, namely the change brought about in the elementary relation between land and sea, and the dawning of what Christopher L. Connery describes as a post-oceanic existence. With the 20th century's revolution in the means of transportation and communication, all spatial distinctions are obliterated, including the essential divide between land and sea. Rather than revolutionizing spatial distinction so as to establish new ordering lines, the world-spanning rootlessness of modern technology irrevocably deprives the world of all matter and extension, reducing it to a network of long-distance vectors and transits that cycle in smooth, characterless monotony. Notwithstanding the tone of these modern spatial diagnostics, Schmidt's writings obviously manifest uncertainty and ambivalence about the new world order in which space has lost significance. In the conclusion to Land and Sea, Schmidt speculates that the human race stands at the threshold of a new epoch, that with the destruction of the old European nomos, a new order of planetary space begins to emerge. Quote, "In its place, the new nomos of our planet grows unceasingly and irresistibly. It is summoned by the new relations of humans to the old and to the new elements, and the altered measurements and relations of human existence compel it. Many shall see in it only death and destruction. Some believe themselves to be experiencing the end of the world. In reality, we are only experiencing the end of the relation between land and sea, which had held up to this point." And yet, Schmidt's spatio-historical critique of an increasingly technological and abstract modernity implies that the second global spatial revolution is incapable of producing any ordering measures of global space, and in fact will only systematically undermine the conditions for global order as such. Indeed, as Ullmann relates in his introduction to Theory of the Partisan, in a diary entry from 1948, Schmidt appears to have delivered his last word on the future of spatial order, writing, quote, "That is the new nomos of the earth. No more nomos." End quote. This sentiment, while not as boldly expressed in his published works, is reflected throughout his major spatial writings, negatively, in his concerns with the forces of disorder that threaten to accelerate the disappearance of boundaries and demarcations, and positively through his search for a catacon, a barrier or true forestaller capable of preventing the dissolution of space and defending local, particular cultural traditions against relentless spatio-historic universalization. The closest Schmidt comes to identifying such a defender of ordering distinctions was the marginal figure of the telluric partisan, representing a specifically terrestrial character. Such a figure, Schmidt argues, is the last bearer of an order grounded in the earth, one who, quote, defends a piece of land with which he has an autochthonous relation, end quote. However, according to Schmidt's own estimations, the telluric partisan's prospects for defending a local space and autochthonous way of life against the process of techno-industrial acceleration are considerably grim. Quote, when the internal, immanent rationality and regularity of the thoroughly organised technological world has been achieved, the partisan becomes nothing more than an irritant. Then he disappears, simply of his own accord in the smooth-running fulfilment of technical functional forces, just as a dog disappears on the freeway. End quote. These and other similarly bleak prognostications sit uneasily alongside Schmidt's cautiously optimistic note regarding the rise of the New World Order, suggesting that what might first appear as ambivalence on closer inspection reveals a much deeper-seated sense of world historical pessimism. Sloterdijk's spherological reclamation of space. It is against this background of the apparent disappearance of space, as well as the sense of world historical doom and destruction, that Sloterdijk endeavours to undertake, quote, a sort of reconquest of space, by postulating it as a good type of extension and as a principle of discretion, end quote. Although Schmidt has never made the sustained focus of Sloterdijk's own world historical musings on spatial modernity, Sloterdijk nonetheless ranks him, along with Sigmund Freud, Jacques Lacan, Theodor Adorno and Arnold Gehlen as, quote, one of the most successful modernisers of the pessimist syndrome in the 20th century, end quote. This is not to say, however, that Sloterdijk rejects Schmidt's recounting of spatial history, or that he counters Schmidt's pessimism of resignation with the rhetoric of neoliberal economic globalisation. To the contrary, throughout his works on globalisation, particularly the last chapter of Globes and In the World Interior of Capital, Sloterdijk approvingly paraphrases many of Schmidt's arguments and tropes regarding modernity's spatial revolutions, though often without duly acknowledging his indebtedness. In particular, Sloterdijk affirms Schmidt's periodization of modernity into the epochs of sea and air appropriation, highlighting both the changes in world spatial consciousness that attend geo-elemental transitions and the ramifications of these shifts on the ordering of planetary space. Concerning the latter, he echoes Schmidt in singling out first the rise of liberal universalism and the world system of psychedelic capitalism in the age of discovery, and then, with the emergence of electronic globalization, for Sloterdijk the global, third phase of globalization, the accelerated transformation of the world into a globalized locational space of routinized traffic and radio-electronic systems. Indeed, drawing explicitly, if only briefly, on Schmidt, Sloterdijk asserts that through the various taco-technologies of the 20th century, taco-technologies? E.g., telephone networks, radio systems, jet engines and air travel, the spatial revolution of the present effectively modernised Marx and Engels' pronouncement that, quote, all that is solid melts into air, end quote, to the spatially neutralising, quote, all that is extended and demands space is compressed into a minimal, inert block, end quote. Once human beings enter the 20th century, he argues, the global, technologically enabled market ensures that each point on the Earth's surface becomes a relay point, or potential address for the infinite mobilization of capital. Like Schmitt, but much more explicitly, Sloterdijk affirms Heidegger's interpretation of modernity as an epoch in which the discovery of the world entails rendering and then conquering the world qua image, or in Heidegger's terms, producing the hitherto concealed unconcealment. Producing the hitherto concealed into unconcealment. On this view, Sloterdijk argues the succession of diverse recording procedures and image-producing technologies that began in the early voyages of discoveries resulted in the new image of the Earth, the terrestrial globe, or, quote, the Earth made known, unquote. This newly imaged Earth, which became the central icon of the modern worldview, made possible all acquisitions of land and sea, and eventually air, while supplanting ancient and medieval preconceptions of the totality of the world as an all-encompassing cosmological sphere with no outside. All is of a piece with Schmitt's Heidegger-like critique of spatial modernity, as is Sloterdijk's argument that the distance-destroying revolution of terrestrial globalization reaches its completion with the installation of an electronic atmosphere and the replacement of the curved Earth with an almost extensionless point, quote, a network of intersection points and lines that amount to nothing other than connections between two computers any given distance apart, end quote. Over and above these historical interpretive similarities, Sloterdijk takes seriously the costs of spatial revolutionary changes, readily acknowledging that in the field of culture most people keenly perceive the destruction of space and the abolition of distances as bad news, going so far as to claim that to understand the history of modern humanity it is necessary to begin with melancholy. At the same time, the very nature of Sloterdijk's reclamation project presupposes an attitudinal break with cultural pessimism, whose representatives such as Schmitt, he argues, quote, tend, with eminently sensible pretexts, to abandon undertakings in which they can no longer dream of themselves and those close to them as the winners, end quote, making allies with the call of "Stop history!" but achieving little against the unleashed visionary energy of the project makers and entrepreneur charlatans. Eschewing the rotating succession of philosophies of progress and downfall which, on Odo Marquard's view, characterises the present era's exhilarated unworldliness, Sloterdijk instead pursues a radical middle path of reconceiving and rewriting the human ability to constitute and restore integrity to inhabitable space within the interior of a despatialized and synchronous world. His departure from the alternation of utopia and apocalypse is not, however, simply a matter of attitude or outlook. Rather, it is rooted in, or at least corresponds to, a distinctive philosophically anthropological understanding of space, one that, while sharing much in common with Schmitt's spatial philosophy, departs from it in significant ways. Arguably, that divergence stems from the theoretical core of Sloterdijk's spheres project, or spherology, namely his critique of the limited analysis of being with found in Heidegger's thesis regarding the spatiality of being in the world, that, quote, in Dasein there lies an essential tendency towards closeness, end quote. Starting from this basic insight, through which Heidegger attempts to correct modernity's atopological biases toward the self-sufficiency and inner sense of the individual. Sloterdijk shifts the discussion toward the site or locus in which human ensembles produce the space they inhabit as their sphere of relationship and animation. For that reason, Sloterdijk thinks that Heidegger's being in the world may more aptly be described as a being in spheres, in which the in of Heidegger's being in the world and the there of being there, the da of Dasein, point to the primordial need and ability of humans to engage in local world construction, to cultivate and preserve themselves by designing self-harbouring containers or autogenous vessels of interpersonal resonance and solidarity. Wherever they arrive, wherever they settle, he wrote, they always bring their ability to create their own particular interior and its mood. Central to this redescription is the inherent sociality or co-existential dimension of spatial being. Spheres are the original product of human being together in cooperation. They are, quote, shared spaces set up by common inhabitation within them, the primal agreement of the community about itself, within itself, end quote. Because these co-creative building spheres assume varying forms of what Sloterdijk describes as atmospheric symbolic glass houses and internal climates of shared space, they are best thought of as adaptive structures that serve as practicing immune systems. That is, they comprise symbiotic figures between container and thing contained that offer mutual protection. Such morpho-immunological edifices, he argues, range from very small microspheres like the uterus to very large macrospheres such as ancient walled cities, the nation-state, and, with the completion of terrestrial globalization, the capitalist world system. While near the end of Globes, Sloterdijk suggests that the macro-spherological structures of modernity have lost their immunizing power, reflecting, in his own terminology, Schmidt's interpretation of englobement as the loss of nomos. The spherological approach to the spatial dimensions of the world enables Sloterdijk to reconsider the possibilities for re-spatializing what globalization and the infinite mobilization of capitalism tend to neglect and despatialize, that is, local, co-existential spaces of vital interiority. This way of thinking mirrors that of Bruno Latour, one of Sloterdijk's intellectual allies and admirers, who wrote, quote, "There exists no place that can be said to be non-local. If something is to be delocalized, it means that it is being sent from one place to some other place, not from one place to no place," end quote. For that reason, Jean-Pierre Couture argues that attributable task for spherology cannot be one of pessimistic resignation, but rather of relocalizing the global, of engendering and maintaining interior solidary spaces, namely atmospheric systems or communities that immunize their existence by reproducing their distinctive symbolic processes and moods. By the same token, Sloterdijk argues, it is only by means of producing and sustaining a resonance between those who live together that present-day cultures are able to reproduce themselves as domestic climates. Media before all media. spherology as therapeutic strategy. Although Schmidt's philosophy of spatiality is consistent with the view that communities are themselves an effect of the spaces they create, the notion that the atmospheric constitution of culture is the properly fundamental element, or that which makes us possible in a primary way, constitutes the specific conceptual difference separating Sloterdijk's spatial anthropology from that implied by Schmidt's understanding of spatial revolutions. Spheric coexistence thus serves as the extra-attitudinal basis for Sloterdijk's rejection of Schmidt's thesis regarding the spaceless nihilism of englobement, and along with it his fatalistic resignation. Even so, Sloterdijk nowhere makes explicit that the self-attunement or symbolic climatization of shared spaces is what distinguishes his spherology from Schmidt's conception of spatiality, and can even appear somewhat cagey about drawing comparisons between his spheres project and Schmidt's spatial turn. Sloterdijk does, however, provide a clue in a note to the last chapter of Globes, The Last Orb. In it he explicitly comments on Schmidt's reference to page 247 of Hegel's Elements of the Philosophy of Right, wherein Hegel acknowledges the importance of the sea element in joining together different nations through the world-spanning growth of industry. Schmidt invokes this passage, so he claims, to argue that his own spatial history of modernity ought to be interpreted as, quote, the beginning of an attempt to bring to fulfillment this, page 247, in a way similar to that in which pages 243 to 246 was brought to fulfillment in Marxism, end quote. Sloterdijk, though, reads this statement as a hollow ambition, and for two reasons, both because of Hegel's negligible importance to the study of maritime modernity, and more important, because Schmidt's narrow emphasis on geo-elements causes him to overlook the decisive media-theoretical dimension of modern power. Schmidt's philosophy of spatiality may nullify any charge of crude environmental determinism, emphasizing as it does a dialectic or mutually constitutive relationship between revolutions of spatial consciousness and elemental transformations. But his account of spatial revolutions, by giving priority to dominion over the elements, overlooks, on Sloterdijk's view, an even more elemental medium: spheres. Sloterdijk's recasting of Heidegger's being in the world as being in spheres thus also functions to round out his critique of Schmidt's spatial pessimism. For Sloterdijk, being in spheres highlights the primordial need and capacity of humans to engage in local world construction, to cultivate and preserve themselves by designing self-harbouring autogenous vessels that provide psychosocial protection against the hazards of life in the world's openness. On this view, being in spheres mediates human existence by establishing the primordial spatial structure of dwelling relations. Quote, one must assume that there is a mid-world position, or a between, that is neither inclusion in the environmental cage, nor the pure terror of being held out into the indeterminate. The transition from environment to world becomes apparent in spheres as between worlds. Spheres have the status of an intermediate openness. They are membrane shells between inner and outer, and thus media before all media. The spherical is the midpoint. It allows its inhabitants to be simultaneously localized in the dimension of nearness and in the monstrous immensity of world openness and world outwardness. End quote. by reconceptualizing being as that being for which being in the world fundamentally means belonging to self-insulating and self-domesticating spheric interiorities, or membranous dwelling containers, Sloterdijk proposes an understanding of mediation prior to, and more fundamental than, the power constitutive role that Schmitt assigns to dominion over the elements. Even though Schmitt acknowledges the human capacity for what Sloterdijk labels spheropoiesis, insofar as human social formations, spheres, are shaped by acts of collective will, they tend to result for Schmitt from decisions about the appropriation of geo-elements, rather than from the elemental media or spherical environments in which people assemble and enable the formation of space by virtue of their coexistence. Quote, "The human has some latitude for his power and his historical empowerment. The human is capable of choice, and in certain historical moments he can even choose the element in which he determines himself as a new collective form of his historical existence through his own deed and his own achievement, and the element in which he organises himself. In this sense, rightly understood, the human has, as the poet says, the freedom to break out where he will." End quote. Sloterdijk's counterposition of spheres as primordial media is therefore the primary means by which he engages with and differentiates his spherology from Schmitt's spatial theory. In so doing, Sloterdijk draws attention to the proxemic means by which we act on and are thereby able to alter the environments that in turn condition us and mediate or come between us and a world considered to be outside, both the pre-existing, handed-down conditions and those that are radically altered by new geo-elemental appropriations and the technological developments. What spherology makes possible is the conceptual theoretical affirmation of the facticity of human being together in spheres, in the face of radical changes to global space and world order. It celebrates the general human resilience under nihilistic anarchic conditions. But more important, spherology prescribes itself as a theoretical perspective for analysing and writing about the multiplicity of ways that we can co-recreate the conditions of our spatial existence in an ongoing process of mediation and climatization through which shared living in an interior is constituted and remains an ever-renewable possibility. If by media Sloterdijk had intended the usual, or even not so usual suspects of mass media, then his criticism of Schmitt's neglect of the role of media in the process of globalization would seem to subserve rather than contradict Schmitt's pessimism regarding the possibility of spatial ordering in an era of post-englobement. Indeed, Sloterdijk himself underscores the centrality of various imaging and memory media, globes, maps, planispheres and atlases, to the accomplishment of circumnavigation in the Age of Discovery, the 20th and 21st century taco technologies, to the completion of electronic globalization. Thanks to global telecommunication, networks and modern mass media, particularly television and more contemporary internet-based medias such as YouTube, Twitter and Facebook, countless points on the Earth's surface have been transformed into homogeneous spaces, defined by the equipotency of points within them and the connectivity of those points through direct lines. Quote, Those born after the advent of television, wrote Sloterdijk, know nothing of the sweetness of life in the boundless world. The true feeling of the modern age, which blossomed here and there in the 1930s, presupposed slow media." Unquote. For those of us living through the current post-electronic phase of globalization, however, the only traditional quality of space that would seem to remain in existence is conductivity, or the combination of conductivity, connectivity, and mediality. The space of distance, however, of meaningful separation and placement in shared harbouring containers, has been replaced by the space of gathering that surrounds us as the technical environment of telecommunication networks and fibre optics. Quote, "Anyone who wants to see the myth of the disappearance of space confirmed," wrote Sloterdijk, "need only reach for the telephone or perform a few mouse clicks." End quote. Thanks to the global network, spatiality today essentially means the accommodation of space to reduction, compression and annulment, to calling up, manipulating, combining, securing, and deleting. Nevertheless, because of the positive perspective afforded by spherology, Sloterdijk is able to counterpose this unhappy description of modernity's distance-destroying compressive effects with an assertion of the continued relevance of spheric extension in local shared enclosures of coexistence and co-immunity. By privileging spheres rather than geo-elements as the most fundamental medium or site of production of human beings, spherology enables Sloterdijk to affirm the current and future possibilities of extended, uncompressed space. Sloterdijk champions in particular the reactionary, by which he means the sphero-poietic or spatially creative impulses of media ecologists such as Marshall McLuhan, Eric Havelock, Jack Goody and company. For Sloterdijk, their participative, recontextualising attitude toward life, as well as their emphasis on oral culture, suggests a therapeutic strategy or pharmacon whereby it becomes possible to articulate, understand and experiment with the various geodesic strata of spatial experience. These impulses are not limited to 20th century intellectuals, Sloterdijk maintains, but have been wandering through the ages in manifold variations, from the spheropoiesis of Jesus, Diogenes, to early socialists, 1960s situationists, and present-day group therapists, and can today be observed in newly manifold reassertions of context over against the effects of decontextualization. This new spatial consciousness, the culture of presence, of which Sloterdijk is both prophet and modern-day chronicler, consists primarily in rediscovering the local as a sphere of non-compressible and non-abbreviated space, an extended inner zone or atmosphere in which emphasis is placed on slowness and embedded passive forms of solidarity. In affirming such spatial thought and practice, Sloterdijk essentially opposes a medial logic of participation, situatedness and locational fidelity, quote, "the autonomous rights of that which is extended in itself," end quote, to the taco-technological progress of decontextualization, compression, mapping and the neutralization of space. Englobement, in other words, or the electronic phase of globalization, cannot supplant lived extendedness or uncompressible spheric extension as long as human beings continue to form local solidary systems in a particular place and extend themselves by means of local resonances and immune systems of repeatable gestures. For Sloterdijk, there is simply no existence without participation in unabbreviated local communities of embeddedness and mutual indwelling, which, as per spherology, is tantamount to saying that localism as such is unsuspendable. Sloterdijk's spherological understanding of localism thus breaks with and potentially undercuts Schmidt's world historical pessimism, because it positions the local as a self-spatializing force rather than an antonym of the global. Ultimately, Schmidt's focus on elemental transformations and appropriations is rhetorically salient only insofar as it refuses to acknowledge Sloterdijk's space-theoretical perspective, according to which, quote, existence, as the positing of a symbolic and physical volume, means residing in the uncompressible, while localism signifies an affirmation of creative extension in the place, end quote. Schmidt, by contrast, in focusing on appropriation, cannot but relate the local and the global to each other in the same way as the point and the field, such that the local is conceived merely as a spot in a homogeneous spatial grid, as a locational place that is either already or well on its way to being appropriated, distributed and reproduced within the post-oceanic monotony of despatialized space. Hence, while both Schmidt and Sloterdijk envisage the re-emphasis of the local as a revolt against the contracted world of a nomosless Earth, spherology entails rejecting the figure of the telluric partisan on the grounds that its orthogonal and martial characteristics manifest a basic misunderstanding of the spatial, or spheric, dimension of our being in the world. Despite the reactionary impulses entailed by participative projects of being extended and being connected in one's own place, localism, on Sloterdijk's view, is engendered and maintained by the spheropoietic co-creation of local force fields in which collective affects circulate and produce mutual solidarities that summon members to participate in the community. Quote, enabling pursuers of personal interests to see themselves as carriers of a shared interest and an exaggerated animation, end quote. This only works, however, insofar as the community, the city, or the nation is capable of sustaining its projective dynamism into the future. That is, when the created space, with its local egotism and local enthusiasm, is stronger than the centrifugal forces of multinational global capital and the synchronous programming power inherent in today's rapidly effective new mass media. This is at once the possibility and ever-renewable challenge of being in spheres, the new spatial revolutionary situation in which the basic situation returns. In the final analysis, the political purchase of Sloterdijk's critical, albeit somewhat subterranean, engagement with Schmidt consists primarily in the capacity of spherology to forward a non-pessimistic alternative to Schmidt's reactionary diagnosis of a spaceless nihilism of world unity. Given Schmidt's relative marginalization in the Spheres project, Sloterdijk eventually did not consider Schmidt a serious interlocutor. From a spherological perspective, Schmidt's notion of spatial revolution and the accompanying spatial history of modernity are lines of thought to be not extended, but overcome. The same holds for Schmidt's exceedingly grim prognostication of an apocalyptic civil war. The world-weary figures of the telluric partisan and the catacon, and the reactionary fantasy of a multipolar world exemplified by an imperialistic federal order between European states. Yet, given the growing subjective adherence that Schmidt's spatial writings enjoy today among right-wing intellectual and activist movements, identitarians and neo-Eurasianists in particular, Sloterdijk's spatial theorization can perhaps best be read as offering a positive anthropological strategy by which to challenge the spatial pessimism that, grounded in nostalgia for a prior mode of global spatial ordering, feeds into today's reactionary geopolitics. To be sure, spherology does not constitute a revolutionary plan of action or militant subjectivity, and in the third volume of Spheres, Sloterdijk juxtaposes spherology with the concept of revolution, provocatively claiming that we have never been revolutionary. Nonetheless, irrespective of what one may think about the continued prospects for revolution in the contemporary era, by providing the theoretical conceptual means to affirm, describe, and potentially inform the medial and atmospheric potentiality of a range of localisms, Sloterdijk's spatial anthropology entails an art of writing that, at the service of experience, is poised to cultivate an immunological awareness in opposition to fatalistic discourses regarding dramatic changes in the material or geo-elemental conditions of society. In working towards an anthropological understanding of the sites of coexistence and lived extendedness, Sloterdijk does not wax nostalgic for older forms of spatial existence, nor is he only or primarily concerned with localized geographies such as the neighborhood and town. For millions of people today, being in spheres manifests in the operative principle of co-isolated existence that links insulated particles making up contemporary social configurations. But rather than long for a mostly vanished organicism or a never-was contractualism, Sloterdijk wants to channel spheropoiesis into the design and reconstruction of new immune systems and techniques, as well as the explication or elaboration of, quote, the facilities, atmospheres, and encompassing situations in which, according to our own plans and assessments, we will reside. End quote. And in that belief, spherology can be recommended as a non-revolutionary political phenomenon capable of generating theory and interpretation and of cross-pollinating with any number of practical, professional, and even personal intuitive pursuits, from installation art and architecture and designs to the mobile cocooning behavioural practices of quasi-nomadic business people. What's more, in asserting and explicating the ever-renewable projective dynamism of locational fidelities, of participation, situatedness, and indwelling in myriad spheric extensions. Sloterdijk's spherological approach to the spatiality of being promises to undermine the kind of reactionary motive that goes into Schmidt's nihilistic vision of a spaceless Earth, and to make ridiculous, rather than heroically tragic, the image of territorial resistance fighters disappearing like dogs on the freeway.